doing part 2 of a 3-part talk that I am doing on this book, Finding Yourself in Transition, which I've probably mentioned a million times, but was written by a professor that both I had in seminary and Vicki had over 20 years ago. So he is a Unity institution. So I hope some of you have had an opportunity to purchase this book. I know a couple of you have. If not, it's still worth getting. You can come up afterwards if you need the exact information. This is the kind of book that would be good to have on your shelf. So it's talking about transitions. But in the book, a transition can be anything from something really huge, like a loved one dying, something catastrophic, or even the more everyday things that we go through, like losing a job, or it could be a major time of change in your life, retirement, or when your kids leave. So it's good for all of those kinds of transitions that we go through. And if you missed part 1, you are welcome to go back and watch it on our Facebook page. It's still there. And that will help you know what you've missed, because I'm not going to take time to recap it today. But today what we're going to do is what he does in the book, which is talk about how we move through transitions in our life through the lens of the story of the Exodus from the Hebrew Bible. And so before I begin, let me say a little bit about how Unity interprets the Bible. Some of you may be real familiar and some not as familiar. So in Unity, and this is like a real overview, we typically don't interpret the Bible as being literal or historically accurate. Rather, we seek to understand what the Bible is trying to tell us today. And so we look at it metaphysically, metaphorically, symbolically. And one of the other ways that we interpret the Bible is by looking at the archetypes that can be found in these stories. So if you know a little bit about psychology, Carl Jung talked about us having this collective unconscious. So it's kind of like these collective memories they're in our DNA, they're things that we all share. We may not be conscious of them, but they're there. And so stories like ancient myths and ancient scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, all of these ancient stories that we have, they contain archetypes. And they speak to the human condition, something that we all understand. And that's why these stories are so enduring. If you feel like the Bible isn't relevant to you today, you're not looking at it the right way. The reason that the Bible is still enduring is not because of the inappropriate ways that it's used to oppress people or whatever, but in those enduring stories that still speak to us because they have these archetypes in them. And so the story of the Exodus is one such story that is just filled with archetypal symbolism. And so as we go through the story, like I said, we're not concerned with historical accuracy. We're not going to get into, we don't care whether Moses really parted the Red Sea. That's not the point. In fact, the case could be made that the ancient Jews, when they told these stories, they didn't understand it literally either. They knew that they were myths, they were stories that were to instruct. So the point is that we can find ourselves in these stories. So we'll go through the story, and we'll see if we can find ourselves in this story. I'll ask you some questions throughout to get you thinking. Now, if we were in a class or a workshop, when I asked those questions, I would give you time to write, to journal, to put down ideas, but obviously we can't. You're welcome to take notes. If you have those little, the little note sheets that we have. But if not, you might take some time later on to jot down some things that came up for you today. So let's begin. So the story of the Exodus is the story of the ancient Hebrews' escape out of bondage in Egypt and their travel to the Promised Land, or the land of Canaan. And it is an archetypal story of transition and of journey. It's about this ancient people's transition from a tribe that was enslaved or in bondage to a nation of people with an identity. Indeed, an identity that still endures today for the Jewish people. So So the Israelites were living as slaves in Egypt, and they had fled their land some 400 years prior because there was severe famine. And they had heard that there was grain in Egypt. So they were living in Egypt, and initially it was a good thing for them. Egypt was a godsend for them. It was a lifesaver because they had food there. So it saved them from the famine that was happening in their homeland. 400 years later, however, they found themselves enslaved to their Egyptian overlords. And they were not very nice to them. They made them work hard, and this, as the story goes, they made their lives bitter with hard service. So this part of the story represents the fact that sometimes that which initially saves us ends up becoming our bondage. So we adopt behaviors and habits and things often initially to cope because we need them, right? They help us get through a certain time. But sometimes we find out years later that that which served us no longer serves us. We have outgrown it, it has outlived its purpose, and now it not only doesn't serve us, but it is now enslaving us. Does that make sense? Like, can you think of something in your life? When I was thinking about this, I thought about just a simple example. Most of you know I have almost 24 years of sobriety, and when I was a young person, I started using alcohol because I was in a lot of pain, emotional pain as a young teenager. And so I used alcohol to numb that pain. Well, that alcohol helped me survive. It helped me cope. Okay, so it's not necessarily a bad thing because I survived those years. However, later on in my mid-20s, still drinking like that became my enslavement and became something that I needed to then abandon. So I'm sure you can think of things like that in your own life. So we begin this part of the story with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And they think that it was probably Ramses II in this story. And so he is making the Jews or the Israelites' lives bitter with hard service. And after 400 years that the Israelites have been settled there, Pharaoh decides that there are too many of them and they're getting too much power. And so he orders the midwives to kill any male child born to a Hebrew woman. Well, the midwives secretly refuse to do it, and so eventually Pharaoh orders that all male children be thrown into the Nile. Then Moses was born to a Hebrew woman, and his mother did not want to throw him in the Nile. So as the story goes, she placed him in a basket and hid him among the reeds. So along comes Pharaoh's daughter and finds Moses in the basket, and she takes him and decides to adopt him and raise him as her own. So Moses, in this part of the story, represents the divine child. And if you look at ancient stories, this is a recurrent motif of the divine child. And it represents that awakening and the birth of our own inner divine child, our real self, that innocence and that newness that is the truth of who we are. And often when a divine child appears, it's ushering in a new order. It's the promise of new life. Think of Jesus, right? Classic story of the divine child. So Pharaoh's daughter gives the baby the name Moses, which means to draw out, which is going to be important. So Moses grows up at Pharaoh's court, and he doesn't know that he's actually a Hebrew. And one day when he's a grown man, he witnesses an Egyptian flogging an Israelite. And he's enraged by what he sees, by the injustice that he sees. And he's so enraged that he kills the Egyptian. He thinks that he hasn't been seen, but it turns out that someone saw him, and Pharaoh is now seeking to kill Moses. So here's the symbolism again. Moses represents the new order, the divine child that is ushering in this new way of being. Pharaoh represents the old order, the old establishment, and he is threatened by the new, and so he wants to kill the divine child. So the two are at odds with one another. Have you ever felt that kind of push-pull in your life? Where you felt like the old and the new were like warring with each other? Or even where you felt like the old way was trying to sabotage or kill the new way? Like sometimes when you're trying to adopt new behaviors, new ways of thinking, new ways of being, and you feel that old way like kind of wanting to come back. You guys are nodding, so I know you relate to that. We've all had that feeling. So that's what this part of the story represents. So Moses manages to escape, and he flees into the Sinai desert, and he's living in the land of Midian. And there he feels a stranger in a strange land. Isn't that how we feel sometimes when we are in the middle of transitions in our life, big changes? Like suddenly we're a stranger in a strange land. Like, where am I? Everything is unfamiliar. And so Moses is tending the flocks near Mount Horeb when he sees a bush that is burning without being consumed. And I wish we had time to go into the symbolism of that, but we don't. So he hears the voice of the Lord telling him that he has been chosen to take his people out of bondage, to draw them out of Egypt and take them to the promised land. Well, Moses is like, what? Me? Like, you talking to me, right? And he feels doubt, and he says, who am I to go to Pharaoh? And the voice of the Lord comes to him and says, I will be with you. So have you ever felt that way, like when you were being called maybe to do something that brought you out of your comfort zone, or to take on a leadership role or something that was like, whoa, who am I to do this? Anybody ever felt that way? I know I felt that way when I got the call to ministry. I was like, me? Michelle from the pew? Are you kidding me? Right? But that voice of the Lord told him, I will be with you. So that is the lesson of this part of the story. We may be called to a transition or a time of change that is challenging, that is difficult, that is frightening for us. We may feel self-doubt. We don't have any promise that those things aren't going to happen. Indeed, those things will happen. But the promise is that we will not be left alone, that the God of our understanding will always be there with us in that. And so when we are in these times, we can turn to the God of our understanding for that comfort and that support that we need. We can affirm the divine presence both in and with us at all times. So Moses is being called to a new identity, a new life. And he's initially fearful, but he knows God will be with him, and so his faith has been strengthened. He has been emboldened. And so he goes back to Pharaoh, and he confronts him, and he says, let my people go. Okay, so Pharaoh refuses. And what happens to Pharaoh? We all know the story. He suffers these 10 terrible plagues. And finally, he decides to let the Hebrews go. That part of the story, especially, I can relate to that, represents that sometimes we have to suffer some really horrible things before we are willing to change, to step into the new. I sometimes have to get pretty uncomfortable until I'm willing to step out of my comfort zone. So Pharaoh lets the Hebrews go, but then he changes his mind, and he sends his army after them. Sometimes when we're on the brink of making a big change, we're like, okay, I'm going to do it. And then we like chicken out, right? We renege. Change our minds. We want to turn back. So there are the Israelites caught between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea. Not a good place to be, right? And so they were pretty fearful. You know, do we turn back? And so in the midst of that fear, Moses tells them, fear not. Stand firm. Trust God. Well, if you were standing between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army, would that be an easy thing for you to do? It's a tall order, but he told them, fear not. Trust God. And so they don't know what's going to happen, but suddenly Moses parts the sea, and the Israelites pass through, and then the sea comes back together and the Egyptians drown. You know, I didn't say the Bible was a soft story, right? So, Brummett, the author of the book, tells us that the lesson in this part of the story is that when we are in that time of change and we're fearful, we need to stand firm and trust God and have faith. And secondly, we need to step forth bravely, like those Israelites passing between the Red Sea. Step forth bravely and with faith. So Moses represents our higher self, that which wants to lead us into a new way of life. And we can trust this guidance, knowing that God or the Lord of our being is always with us. So when we get to this point in a transition, we've made this big decision, or the decision has been made for us, like when someone dies or we get fired or something happens to us that doesn't feel like it's our choice. After the initial drama of that change, sometimes we find ourselves in this place that Brummett calls the void. And it's like the initial shock of whatever has happened is over, and now, like, think if a person dies, you know, initially you're caught up with everything that has to be done, the funeral arrangements, the memorial, all this stuff. When all of that is done, then you're in the void. And that can be a really, really difficult place to be. Because all of the excitement that was keeping you sort of distracted is gone, and now you're just there, and it's like this barren, flat land. And in that place, we may feel lots of feelings, right? Fear, anger, confusion, loneliness, abandonment, and grief. In fact, this stage of the game is so painful and difficult that we often seek to avoid it. Brummett says that many, if not most, of our addictive and dysfunctional behaviors come from avoiding this place. We don't want to be there. It's not fun. The void is a time of stripping away, of releasing the old, letting go, and emptying oneself out. And during that time, we may feel emptied out, right? Like almost like a shell of a person, naked, stark, alone, empty. But it is in that painful time that we frequently encounter our divine self. We're exposed and vulnerable, but we're also willing and super aware. It's like a heightened sense of awareness. Sometimes when everything has been stripped away from us is when we can see clearly, perhaps for the first time. And during that time, we often have to call on our deepest resources just to get through. And so we often encounter a new strength and a new resilience that we didn't know we had when we're in that place. And as we know, the universe abhors a vacuum. So from that emptiness will come new life. But we have to get through that time in the void first. So we're shedding our old identity, our old ways, the old roles, wife, mother, husband, uncle, whatever, co-worker, boss, CEO, whatever it is that we are shedding, we're leaving that behind so that we can become more of who we truly are, uncover more of our Getting rid of our false self so we can discover what our true self is. And always becoming more authentic, more of who we truly are. So Brumett suggests that during this time we don't resist, as hard as it is and as much as we want to avoid being in that place. Now, I would add an aside. Get support, get help, do whatever it is that you need to do to get through that time. And often, one of the things we need to do during times of grief is take breaks from the grief. Can't be in that void place all the time. It's not good for anyone. Watch some TV, do some self-care, get out in nature, whatever it is. But the point is, we need to allow that time to unfold. Because if you remember back in part 1, what I talked about is if we don't sufficiently grieve that part of the process, we're not really moving forward. We're moving forward, but we're carrying this grief on our back. And then the next transition and the next transition, and all of a sudden we're carrying a whole lifelong of grief that hasn't been resolved. So as painful as it is, it's best for us to do the work at the time. So don't resist, feel the feelings, don't rush the process. Don't let anybody tell you it's time to get over it and get on. You take your sweet time. Because it's during this time that the work is happening within us. Think about a butterfly in a cocoon. Doesn't look like anything's happening on the outside, right? That's kind of the void, like nothing's happening. But as we know, all that stuff is happening inside. This is where the real change is taking place in us. So it's during this time that we need to trust the God of our understanding. Trust that guidance of our higher self. Just like the Lord said to Moses, I will be with you. That's the promise. Promise is not that we won't have hard times. We undoubtedly will. The promise is that the Lord of our being, the God of each of our understanding, will always be with us in that. So this is the time to pray, to meditate, to take time for reflection, to practice self-care, and to trust that your inner Moses, that which has called you out of the bondage of your own personal Egypt, is leading you, guiding you into something new, calling you to something higher and better, so that you can become more of who you truly are. So now we've come to that time in our service when we get to practice some quiet time. So I invite you now to gently close your eyes if that's comfortable and sit back and relax. And I'm going to invite you to use your imagination for the next few minutes. Imagine a situation in your life where you are feeling called to change. Some aspect of your life that is in transition. Perhaps it's a circumstance that you're unhappy about, or a situation that you've outgrown. Maybe it's an injustice that you are seeing. Maybe you even have a situation that makes you feel almost as if you were enslaved to it. Perhaps it's a feeling or a habit or a circumstance where you feel you are in bondage to an old way of doing or seeing or being. The situation has become intolerable and you feel that you must flee. You flee into the wilderness and you find yourself a stranger in a strange land. Things are unfamiliar and uncomfortable, but one day you hear a voice telling you that you have been chosen to do great things. You are being called to leave your past behind and step into something new. You may be fearful or full of self-doubt. You may think, who am I to do these things? But the voice of your inner Lord, your inner divinity, says to you, I will be with you. I will be with you. You decide to heed the call of God. You are being called to a new phase of life, a new aspect of your identity. You are afraid, but you cannot ignore the call. You look back again with perhaps some doubt, but suddenly you see that the old way is crumbling, falling away. The waters are parting, and the way is being made clear to you. All of the obstacles are being removed. Perhaps you cannot yet see the promised land, your final destination. But you are determined to move ahead, to keep going. Maybe you don't yet know what the future will look like, where you will end up, or how the situation will turn out. But your inner guide is strong. As you spend time in this place of the void, the wilderness, where you sometimes feel like you are out of place, you find that you are beginning to know yourself better. You are beginning to see things more clearly. As the old ways are being peeled away, your true self is being revealed more and more. You are beginning to see who you truly are. You begin to trust that inner guide, that still small voice that is calling you up out of bondage and into new life. Now imagine that you can see your true self walking next to you, always with you, guiding you, supporting you, strengthening you. And imagine yourself now taking the hand of your true self. And as you hold fast to the hand of your authentic being, you step forward in faith and move boldly into the unknown. I follow my inner guide and it leads me into new life. As I move through times of transition, I can be sure that God, the divine presence within, is always with me. So now I invite you to just spend a few moments in the silence.